In this video, I sat down with a close friend and former partner, Superintendent Domenic Sinopoli, the unit commander of No. 14 Division, the flagship station of the Toronto Police Service. I asked him to talk to me about the role crime analysis plays, as well as any gaps in the current process and execution from a commander's perspective. This is how it went.
Dom Sinopoli, I'm the unit commander here at 14 Division, a place where I started here 35 years ago, and very, very proud and humbled to be back as the unit commander. I think not necessarily specific to policing. I think that in every industry right now, technology is what's leading all aspects of work, specifically with regards to policing. We're now looking at artificial intelligence as a mechanism to investigate. And there's some challenges with that as well, because that intelligence isn't quite at that stage where we want it to be. We're not going to get more officers. The reality is we're recognizing that less and less people are wanting to be police officers. Technology is what's solving a lot of our homicides right now and a lot of our crimes at the local level. Everything is technology based. So I think we need to get to a place where we start using technology to our advantage versus a disadvantage, which is where I actually think we're at right now. We're at a disadvantage. I would love my analysts to be able to predict where things are going to happen. Ultimately, I think if we can set ourselves up in a position where we can predict what is going to happen, when it's going to happen, or how it's going to happen, it will be advantageous to us. But ultimately, I see my analysts to being able to provide linkages to my investigators. I want the analysts to be able to look at a specific crime. If we have an incident that occurred last night, I'd love my analysts to be able to take that incident and everything associated to that incident and link it to anything that impacted that incident and or associates to that incident. I'll give you an example that comes to mind quickly. Break and enter suspects. We have a few individuals that are responsible for a large majority of our break and enters. And when we catch these individuals and we put them behind bars and they stay in jail for a certain period of time, what we don't have, what we're really blind to, is when these individuals are getting out. And right now, the only means by which we could monitor that is to have my analyst physically contact the jail and take notice of when this individual is getting out. And that way, at least we know he or she is out on the road and we can monitor. What we end up finding is that when we see a certain spike in break and enters, the question is who's recently been out of jail. So now we're working backwards. I would love to be able to see our systems line up so that when John Doe is going to be released on Monday, that my major crime investigators have knowledge of that without having to physically go and check up on it. They already get an email, for instance, Monday, John Doe is being released from jail, for your awareness. Traditionally, as you well know, the analyst positions in the various divisions used to be taken up by police officers who weren't necessarily skilled at analyzing crime. I think that we've moved away from that. Specifically in Toronto, we've moved away from that. And we've brought in analysts that have a certain skill set, typically around how to manage and work their way through the various data systems. If I could sort of boil it down to one trait or characteristic, or perhaps even a skill, I'd want my analysts to be curious. When something happens, I would want them to be nosy about, why it happened, where it happened, and just sort of ask questions that would be outside the box. And I would want my analysts to be able to work hand in hand with the investigator and not necessarily wait for the investigator to come to him or her, but for the analyst to take the initiative and actually go to the investigator with whatever information they may have acquired. My understanding, without getting into the weeds, because I don't know what the weeds look like, is that they're pulling data from existing databases. And so I'll ask my analyst, for instance, to compile me a report on, let's say for argument's sake, crime in and around the entertainment district. Well, the analyst would then go into the various databases and pull whatever types of crimes I'm interested in from an existing database, plot it onto whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or onto a Word document, and provide me with that report. Despite the various technologies that are out there, it's still a manual job because this individual is actually going in, pulling this data, and then taking it and physically moving it onto another document. I suspect there's technology out there that would do it for them, that would just do it on a regular basis and pull that information, that data set from the various different databases and plot it however way you want it to plot on a regular basis. Because realistically, what's happening now, my analyst on a weekly basis, we sit down and we have our crime, traffic, and order management meeting with various members of the building. And we go through what's happened in the past, typically in the last 6 to 7 days. That is all data that is captured on the CTOM portal that's being operated by headquarters. Typically what he is doing is he's just reading what's already there. There's really no analysis that's taking place. That's essentially something that I could do on my own. I can just go click into it, look at it, and I can tell you exactly what's happening in my division. We're not really analyzing any of that data. We're not looking at it and saying, how can we use this data to our advantage? What we're using it for is to tell us what is happening in our division. I don't necessarily need that as much because, quite frankly, I read my morning report every morning. My detective sergeant comes in and sits with me and we go through our morning report every morning. If there's any person in this building that has knowledge of what's going on in the building, it's me, because I get that every day. What we're not seeing is the other officers. The other officers that are inside this building don't necessarily have knowledge of what's taking place. And so that's what we've tried to do here at 14 Division, is we've tried to expand that CTOM. We've gone, these are one of the benefits of COVID, quite frankly, is that we've gone virtual on our CTOM. And now we've invited everybody in the division to take part in that CTOM. Whether you're working or not working, we're all connected to our connected devices. They log on and gives them an opportunity to listen to what's going on or what has happened, and any information that the individual investigators can share with the majority of the people that are on there. But at the end of the day, it's still information that has happened, not information, it's not taking us forward, it's just information sharing on what's already happened. I'd want to be able to have access to information at lightning speed and not necessarily wait 1 to 2 weeks for a specific report to be prepared. Now, I appreciate that a lot of the restrictions are resource based. We only have one analyst, only works so many hours a day, and those are restrictions on our abilities to properly analyze. I think if I had an opportunity to build, I think it would be something where we would build from a resource perspective. We would have more than one analyst. We would have analysts that were able to talk to one another. We would have analysts that talk to one another. And I think to some extent it is happening now, but only for the ones that actually take it upon themselves to initiate that relationship with perhaps a neighboring analyst. I don't think we're at that point where we're sharing data as well as we could be. For instance, I can check out John Doe, and I will have access to information in relation to John Doe that is specific to Toronto Police, unless it's on CPIC. But I'm blind to anything that John Doe has done outside of the Toronto area. If you go into, for instance, York, and we know that today there really aren't any borders. I mean, it's a borderless crime that's taking place. We have all kinds of criminals that are coming in from out of province, coming in from Quebec. We are completely blind to what's happening in other parts of the country, but moreover, we're blind to what's happening to other parts of Ontario that are actually attached to Toronto. Because what we don't have is we don't have a system that speaks to all officers in all agencies in and around, let's say for argument's sake, the GTA. We're completely blind to that. You would actually have to go and contact that particular agency and ask those questions. An example of that is, for instance, when you go because you need a criminal record check, you got to go to the specific agency where you reside. Well, you could reside in Toronto and have no occurrences in Toronto, unless of course there's a criminal charge. You can have no occurrences in Toronto, but you can have several occurrences in Peel. We don't talk to one another. That information would not be captured in that criminal record check, the vulnerability check, because it happened in a different jurisdiction. I would love to be able to see us at a point where there is no borders, where when I run John Doe's name, I get information that comes to me from Toronto, York, Peel, Quebec, Alberta. It shouldn't matter because criminals don't respect any borders, and neither should we. We should have a system, or at least a mechanism by which this information comes to us fluently. I can't think of too many investigations, unless they are very, very specific, that wouldn't or couldn't rely on an analyst. Quite frankly, we don't use them enough. We rely a lot on our analysts to tell us what has happened, and we don't rely on them enough to tell us how or when it's going to happen again. And I think that in the law enforcement community, to be blunt, sometimes we think we know it all as police officers. And I'll give you a perfect example. Last year, assisting with the planning of the biggest carnival parade in Canada taking place here in 14 Division. And I tell my people is that you know law enforcement. What you don't necessarily know is security. Security and policing may go hand in hand, but are not necessarily the same thing. And it's the same thing with analysis. While you may know how to investigate a crime, you may not know how to analyze the data. And that is where you have to lean on your analyst and go to the analyst and say, this is what I want to do. How can you help me get there? How can you tie this into that? We don't do enough of that. So I think a lot has changed. I mean, particularly as it relates to the us and them mentality. I know specifically in Toronto, we have civilianized a lot of positions, the crime analyst being one of them, because we've recognized that, some people do that job better than we do. And while an analyst may have access to information and or the skill sets in order to get access to that information, i.e. they would know how to operate a certain database or program, I don't know that analysts actually have had any training in terms of policing. Like, for instance, do analysts actually ever take a general investigator's course? My guess is they probably don't. So they may not necessarily know exactly what police officers or investigators are looking for because they know how to decipher data. They don't necessarily know, how that data is going to help a police officer or an investigator get from A to B. So perhaps one of the things that analysts could do is start getting involved in some of the courses that are available that will help them learn how to investigate a crime. Because I think that if they have that sort of knowledge, they'll be of better use to the investigators themselves. I mean, I don't necessarily know specifically what criteria or what skill sets for hiring an analyst exist, but if I was a betting man, I would bet that they have very little police training. And I think that police training would be an incredible asset to them. And the more training they have, the more of an asset they are, better the relationship between them and the investigators would be. When I think of an analyst, you come to mind. And I think that you're very good at what you do because of your policing background, which is, why I suggested that some of these analysts should have some sort of police training, because I think it will benefit them. If you have the opportunity as an analyst to get some sort of training, I would highly recommend it. But besides that, I think that what would be key for an analyst is for the analyst to take the initiative and go to the investigator and say, how can I help you? Or, this is what I know I can do. Will this help you? Because sometimes, we get so involved in what we're doing and it becomes sort of like this tunnel vision. You keep doing the same thing over and over again. And if you don't have someone that opens that door and say, hey, do you need a hand? Can I help you? You may not necessarily know how they can help you. So my recommendation to the analyst would be is to take that initial step to approach the investigators and say, this is how I can help, or ask them specifically, how can I help you? At least that way, what ends up happening is you build a relationship with that investigator. And we all know the backroom talk. Once you start building relationships with people, it becomes infectious. And when one investigator knows that they've used an analyst successfully as part of their investigation, guess what's going to happen? Every other investigator is going to want to do the same thing. So you have to take those baby steps. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate what you do to make them better at what they do.
That's Domenic Sinopoli, police superintendent, former colleague, and friend. Thanks for watching this episode. Click here to watch our other videos, and let me know what you think in the comments below. And do me a favor, hit that like, it really makes a difference. See you next time.